Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor by air.
Ask not what your country can do.
President Kennedy has been shot.
One small step for man.
These truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the lunch counter in this Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworths, in February of 1960, 4 college freshmen took a stand by simply sitting down.
The day that we decided to sit down, we figured we could go to jail. If that was what we faced, then it was worth doing that.
By asking for a cup of coffee and a donut, Joe McNeil and his friends had taken on segregation, an established way of life in the American South, one which would not allow blacks to eat with whites at a lunch counter or use the same restrooms or drink from the same water fountains.
There comes a time in life where you say, hey, we're going to confront it and see where it goes.
Within weeks of the Greensboro sit-in, similar protests were breaking out in more than 30 southern cities.
There was an astounding, rapid ripple effect because every time you turned on the radio or TV, there was another sit-in someplace. And all of the people sitting in were young.
We had crossed the line. I was no longer afraid of being arrested and afraid to go to jail. The first time I got arrested, I tell you, I was free. I was liberated.
Young people getting arrested on purpose so they could be free. They touched the conscience of America.
As we began to see what was coming out of the South, we knew that there was something wrong in this country. And I think that that had a powerful effect on us. The effect was to believe that it was possible to make change in the world and that you had a responsibility to take part in that change.
In the early 1960s, young people came to the forefront in America. The civil rights movement was often driven by their anger. The culture of the era was certainly shaped by their tastes and desires. The country would elect its youngest president at the beginning of the decade. His energy and enthusiasm seemed to promise a revitalized nation, a country spirited and strong enough to meet the challenges at home and, in an increasingly dangerous world, the challenges abroad. The Cold War's shadow continued to hang like a dark cloud over an otherwise optimistic horizon. The presidential candidates in 1960, Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon, were only in their mid-40s. Both were ardent Cold Warriors.
But I am not satisfied as an American to be second to the Soviet Union. What we want to do is not to turn their way, but to do it our way. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this campaign.
The country had a consensus at that time. There were no real divisions among the majority of Americans over the Cold War and communism. And Nixon and Kennedy emphasized their anti-communist credentials, which were sterling on both sides.
Both men were Navy veterans. The candidates had been freshman congressmen together after the war. But somehow Kennedy seemed the younger and identified himself as the candidate of a new generation.
His enthusiasm, his energy and determination was infectious, and we all felt, and the country felt, that yes, we're on the march again, and it was a good march. we went to several states to campaign.
I was in my early 20s. I walked a precinct in Redondo Beach. I don't think I've ever done that before or since. He affected everybody.
The favorite candidate of much of the entertainment community reached the high point of his campaign in a series of debates on television.
These were the first presidential debates ever. There'd never been a presidential debate before.
Smith, Senator Kennedy.
And the fact that it was happening live and on television gave it a kind of theater that was remarkable.
The question now is, can freedom be maintained?
The candidates were close on the issues, particularly on a tough stand against the Soviet Union.
I, of course, disagree with Senator Kennedy.
Studies after the debate show that those who heard it on the radio thought Mr. Nixon had won. Those who saw it on television gave the edge to Kennedy.
Supply and demand into balance. Attempt
The image that came over definitely favored Kennedy.
Surplus, which breaks the price.
To see his earnestness, to feel his charm, to feel his idealism, I'm convinced that he would not have won without the debates.
After the closest presidential election of the century, the country's oldest elected president at the time was succeeded by its youngest.
I remember watching the inaugural with pleasure and even a kind of pride. I was struck by the fact that he didn't wear an overcoat, though it was a very cold January day.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
It was very exhilarating in a sense to have a man as young and articulate and electric as John Kennedy was. What he said was quite hawkish when you look back on it.
That we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
After the soaring words of the inaugural speech, the inaugural parties gave final proof to the notion that a younger and more glamorous administration had arrived.
I remember Lenny Bruce saying, "Isn't it great to have a president who you can imagine sleeping with his wife?" And I thought at the time, God, I think that too. You could identify with a man in that sense. He had, it was the first president that seemed like a guy, not like something on a dollar bill.
The idea of a White House run and staffed by younger people, with a 32-year-old chief speechwriter and a press secretary in his 30s, and all these people around Kennedy, there was that feeling that, well, if they're running the political system, surely we can be somehow involved in it.
We wanted to serve. We wanted to do something because young people, me included, in those days, did wonder how we were ever going to top the generation before us. Our fathers had fought World War II. They had won. They had beaten a depression in some way. What are we going to do?
On April the 12th, 1961, the Soviets sent cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the globe.
The first Sputnik in '57 and then Yuri Gagarin going into space in '61 terrified the American people. People were sitting around and talking about what would we do if the Russians had arms missiles, whatever, on the moon. And could shoot, we were making this stuff up, but shoot at us at will. Then we'd have to surrender, you know, we had to choose better red than dead. That's what people were thinking then.
In what would become a spiraling series of superpower moves and countermoves, just 3 weeks after the Soviets manned launch, the U.S. sent astronaut Alan Shepard into space. And President Kennedy promised even greater heights.
We choose to go to the moon.
A man on the moon, walking on the moon? Now, in this decade?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
You gotta be kidding. But Kennedy wasn't kidding.
Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
This bold push into space was also seen as an aggressive manifestation of the Cold War. And so was a Kennedy-supported CIA scheme in April of 1961 to land Cuban exiles in their homeland to ignite an uprising against Fidel Castro. When the mission failed, leaving the exiles stranded at Cuba's Bay of Pigs, America and the president were humiliated. 3 months later, as if sensing American weakness, Khrushchev demanded that all Allied forces be removed from Berlin.
We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force.
Kennedy put the United States pretty close to a war footing. A lot of people like me got draft notices. It looked like we were going to war.
For the second time in the century, Americans faced the threat of war over Berlin. But now, both sides had nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. No president ever spoke more frankly to the nation about the real possibility of nuclear war.
In the event of an attack, the lives of those families which are not hit in a nuclear blast and fire can still be saved if they can be warned to take shelter and if that shelter is available. We owe that kind of insurance to our families and to our country.
Families were advised to build bomb shelters. Schools held atomic attack drills.
When I was a kid, I was very worried about the bomb. And I used to sit under that desk thinking, now, would the radiation fall on top of the desk and miss me? But what happens when I get out from under the desk? Then will the radiation fall? I mean, I didn't quite get it, but it didn't seem to be sensible that I was hiding under this desk. And so I had this worry, and everybody talked about this worry about the bomb.
This nuclear threat over Berlin was diffused, but the Soviet-American confrontation would continue. In October of 1961, the Soviets began building the Berlin Wall. The wall would become a symbol of the Cold War's brutal reality. The newsreels presented Americans with haunting images of people risking their lives to escape communism.
Once a country went communist, it stayed communist. They had secret police and the whole totalitarian structure so that there was no regressing. That the Soviet Union and its allies were a formidable global presence seemed very clear to me.
An even more direct threat to American security began to unfold on October the 14th, 1962, when American U-2 surveillance planes flying over Cuba made a discovery.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that the Soviets would introduce nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba, targeted on the eastern part of the United States. They never had moved nuclear weapons off the soil of the Soviet Union. We didn't believe they would. They did.
It was my father's decision and his own idea.